morning. I'm Elaine Chapnick, president of the Larchmont Mamaroneck Local Summit, and I welcome you to our opening meeting of this new season. Before we begin today's program, though, I want to announce that our October meeting next month will finally once again be in person. It will be held at a lovely room in the Westchester Jewish Center where there is convenient parking and where there will be a breakfast of bagel, pastry, fruit, coffee, or tea provided for $10. There will be a streaming option, but we urge you all to attend because it's so much more fun to see each other face to face and to see our speakers face to face and be able to ask them in person the questions that we need to ask. Now, however, I will, now that I've delivered anyway this exciting news, I'll turn today's program over to Claudine Hutton, who will moderate the discussion, and Peggy Jackson, who will oversee the Q&A which follows. Claudine?
Good morning. Thank you, Elaine. So 2 years ago, as all of you know, the remnants of Hurricane Ida swept through our area, dumping more than 8 inches of rain in about 12 hours' time. Now, such storms used to be considered once in a century events. But now, thanks to a warming planet and more moisture in the air, we're getting sudden and huge amounts of rainfall on any given day. Now, as many of you know, there is an active and critical discussion happening between our federal, state, and local officials about the best policy and structural remedies to help us with this flooding, to protect our businesses, our residences, as well as our natural habitats. And there is, of course, a much wider discussion happening on tackling the climate change that underlies a lot of these issues. Those topics are for another session. What we're here to discuss today is really flooding 101, the basics of how to protect yourself from floodwaters, as well as what to do if you are affected. And so to help answer these questions, I want to introduce our two speakers. Daniel Sarnoff is the Deputy Village Manager for the Village of Mamaroneck. For more than a decade, he's helped oversee the village's day-to-day operations and planning, including flood mitigation and flood response. And JoAnne Murray, the president and owner of Allan Block Insurance Agency in Tarrytown, New York. Among her many roles, JoAnne served on the boards of her local Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Tarrytown Comprehensive Planning Committee. And in her 35 years in the business, she's gathered a whole lot of professional accolades as well. But before we get started, just one production note. As Elaine mentioned, Peggy will be back in a little while to help take your questions. So please submit them in the chat in the meantime as they come to you. Address them to the host and the panelists, or once we're at that portion of the program, make sure you can also raise your hand as well, as many of you enjoy doing. So with that, let's get started. Dan, I'd like to start with you. Tell me, we're gathered here today, like I said, to sort of talk about flooding 101, but also, you know, not just for people who've recently arrived here, but for people who've lived here for quite some time. There's always new information to learn. What is your sense of what people are not getting about our current flood threats? What are they misunderstanding or even underestimating about where we stand right now?
I think what I've seen is every flood is a little bit different. Ida, impacted locations that have never been impacted in the past. And there are a lot of factors that determine the extent of each flood. As I've talked about in the past, if you have a heavy rainstorm when the ground is frozen, the water will not penetrate into the ground. It'll go into the river. It'll just street flood. So a 2-inch storm with frozen ground can do just as much damage as a 5 or 6-inch storm during normal circumstances. Again, also after prolonged rain, if the ground is saturated, obviously the ground will not accept any water, will not penetrate. It will also street flood, go into the river, elevate the river already, and cause more flooding. And that it will happen, and it could happen to you, and be prepared. And
Yes.
As a general rule, some of the preparations you would take if you need to evacuate your home as a result of flood are the same general rules you would have to follow for any emergency. That's why you would advocate for things like your ready-go bags, packing and having items on hand that you can take with you in the event that you need to evacuate your home, irrespective of whether it's caused by flood, a prolonged electrical outage, whatever hazardous incident may befall the village.
Thank you. Elaine, what do you think? Or sorry, excuse me, JoAnne, what are you thinking? What else would you add? What else are people not understanding or getting incorrect or underestimating?
Climate change is very real, and every day we're witnessing the sudden changes in weather patterns and the severity of the storms as they roll in. And people will say to me, I've lived here for 50 years and never had water in my basement. But they're failing to recognize that our weather patterns are changing, and how your property responded in a storm 50 years ago is not what's happening today. As Dan said, it depends on what's going on with the weather and frozen ground or not frozen ground. Topography is changing. And as more and more buildings are going up, people are knocking down their homes and building bigger structures, putting in pools, putting in curbs. Well, this changes the path of water. So again, what didn't happen 5 years ago might all of a sudden happen now. So people need to understand that, and they need to be prepared for that. And one of the things is buying flood insurance, and many people will not spend the money. They'll spend $2,000 or more for their homeowner insurance, and they sure don't think a fire is going to happen, but they won't spend $800 or something like that for the flood insurance. So that's basically what I'm seeing.
Right. We're definitely going to spend some time on flood insurance, but quickly, Dan, I want to go back to some of the basic preparations we were talking about. There's some common steps, measures that homeowners and renters can take now while the sun is shining, right? We're going to sort of go through the narrative today of before, during, and after a storm. It's worth reviewing the basics, right? So valuables and irreplaceables and plastic containers are out of the basement altogether. Cleaned out gutters, drains, gas for the generator, signed up for emergency alerts. All these things seem common sense, although when our lives get busy, sometimes it's easy to overlook these basic steps, which can really make a difference. Dan, you mentioned a go bag. I know that that's something that's really important to you. Can you tell us what's in your go bag? What do you think is important to always have ready? And then we're going to get into the insurance question.
Well, before the website ready.gov, and it's ready.gov/kit. And it tells you the basic supplies you should have. Water, basically says 1 gallon per day for several days for drinking and sanitation. Food, several days, non-perishables. A battery-powered or hand-cranked radio, flashlight, first aid kit, extra batteries, a whistle to signal for help, dust mask, plastic sheeting and duct tape, moist towelettes, certain tools like wrenches or pliers, a can opener, maps, and cell phone with chargers and a backup battery. Those little battery packs are pretty inexpensive nowadays. Personally, I have 3 of them at home, right next to me. The other thing that you should also keep with your go bag is important information like your insurance information, because if you lose that information in your house, that is a very big issue that you have to deal with, because you have to have your policy numbers, you have to know who to contact, and make sure you have that information in more than one location, or at the very least in a secure location that you have on your person with you.
Right. And all this brings us back to JoAnne's point, which is, these documentations and serial numbers and everything assumes that you actually have insurance coverage for potential flooding. So JoAnne, can you walk us through the situation with insurance coverage? Why do people seem to get tripped up on this step? Can you walk us through a little bit the difference between basic residential coverage and flood insurance, and why do people sometimes mistake the two?
Well, homeowner insurance doesn't cover flood, and people get hung up on, the definition of flood. A pipe breaks and your basement's flooded, that's covered. But if it's water that's coming in permeating through the walls, the floors, backing up through drains, you're not going to have coverage under your homeowner policy. You need to have a flood insurance policy. People think that flooding just won't happen to them. I mean, FEMA says 40% of all flood losses occur to homes that are not in a flood hazard zone. And the people who are not in the flood hazard zone, where the bank doesn't require them to carry it, they think it's just not going to happen to them. So they don't have the right insurance. And, I would prefer to see flood insurance included on every homeowner policy, but I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. Well, and so I'm, try to convince people to buy the flood insurance. When people buy a home, the first thing I say is just buy it for a year. Buy it for a year until you know how your water is flowing on your property. There's private flood insurance and there's the FEMA flood insurance. If you have if your home is insured with one of the high value companies like Chubb, Pure, AIG, Cincinnati, they offer flood insurance. And that flood insurance is much more comprehensive than what FEMA offers. So, talk to your agent, ask them what's available. It's important to understand your insurance portfolio before the claim happens. And, talking to your agent is the best way to figure that out. Some people think that flood insurance isn't available for them because they're not in a flood zone. They think, oh, I'm not in a flood hazard area, so I can't buy it. And that's not the case. You can buy it. And again, talk to your agent about it. Ask for a flood determination. Ask the agent to run that. That piece of paper has so much information on it. It will tell you how far you are from how close the nearest flood zone is. It will tell you how many losses have been in your area over the years. It's a really telling piece of paper that they recently changed their flood zone determination to be very informative. So ask for it, take a look at it. I think a lot of people would not be as reluctant to buy the flood insurance if they, saw that.
I'm going to go through sort of some quick rapid fire questions with you for a minute, but before I forget, can renters get flood insurance as well? How does that work?
Yes. The landlord buys the flood insurance policy for the building and the tenant has to buy it for their contents. The landlord can't insure a tenant's contents, whether it's for fire, vandalism, anything. The tenant is responsible to get their own insurance, and flood insurance is available.
Real quick, just sort of rapid fire. So the basics of FEMA flood insurance. What's the average cost around here for a homeowner? What does it cover and what does it not cover? Okay.
The average cost has changed a lot. I can't even begin to answer that because now with the 2.0 rating for the flood, it's the longitude and latitude of your home is determining what the premium is going to be. So where I could say if you were not in a flood zone, your premiums would be $600, $700, $800. They could be $300. They could be $1,200. The flood insurance doesn't cover, the FEMA flood insurance doesn't cover a finished basement, but it will cover the cleanup and the cost of replacing service equipment like your furnace, hot water heater, things like that. So you definitely, should have it because that cleanup cost can at least be $20,000. I've seen it even worse than that. So, the FEMA product doesn't give you loss of use. It's not going to cover you if you need to stay somewhere else. You can't stay in your home. A private product will. Unfortunately, in New York State, we don't really have access to a lot of private policies yet. Other states, I sell it all the time. But in New York, the only companies that right now that are selling it are high value ones like Chubb and Pure and AIG.
But at a sort of baseline significance, they do cover HVAC and
yes.
Sort of the more expensive systems that most of us have in our basements. Things that you can't necessarily button up and put in a plastic bin or move upstairs easily. And there's a difference between, like you said, between structure and content. And that's different types of coverage that you can elect in either private or public policy.
You can buy just building. a lot of people who buy a home where the mortgage company requires them to have flood insurance. And if you're in an AE zone, you're in a V zone, you're in one of those flood hazard zones, it can get very costly. You could easily be $2,000 or more to insure your home for flood. And you know, those policies are critical to if a flood occurs. And you can buy just building, you can buy building and contents, you can buy just contents. So I've seen people where they're very expensive just by building because they don't put anything in the basement. They know, they suspect something will happen. Everything's up on risers, or the furnace and all the heating equipment's been moved to the first floor. And so then they just insure the building. If you build new today, you have to build to FEMA standards where you're raising everything above the base flood elevation. So, you know, those are things that people need to think about.
Okay. For those who haven't bought a house recently, you explained to me, and then we're going to move on. You explained to me that if you live in a flood zone, you're required by your mortgage lender to get flood insurance. But if you don't, you told me you still have to sign a document acknowledging that it's recommended, but you're turning it down. Is that true?
Yes, that is required in New York State now. If I'm selling a new policy to someone or rewriting their policy from one company to another, they have to sign a document rejecting flood insurance. We have to provide them with a quote for that. So every new policy that goes out of here has that rejection form. And so, some people, it will perk them up and they'll be like, why am I rejecting this? And then you can have a conversation. And as I said, you know, we'll recommend buy it for a year, understand your property before the next rainstorm comes in.
Yeah. All right. Well, speaking of which, so let's move along in the narrative. So that's the before. The sun is shining. We're clear-headed. We're thinking about what we can do to prepare. So let's say the day comes, another storm. you look down your basement stairs and you see a few inches of water building, more than the dry vac can handle. Or if you live in a low-lying area or it's a really big storm, you come home from an evacuation and see a real mess. I guess, Dan, again, I'm going to go back to you. You obviously need to think about drying out as quickly as possible. You need to think about calling your insurance agent, if you have it, as quickly as possible to start filing a claim. You need to think about getting the basement dried out, the water out, getting the wet stuff out, the wet porous stuff out of your house, and even if you're the handy type, starting to bust the walls open once you get the water out to really start that drying process. What are the hazards at this point? What are the missteps that people can make when they look down and they see a pile of water, or they come back and they see really something catastrophic? Where do people get tripped up at this stage? Where are the hazards that they should be aware of?
Well, I think the first thing is, making sure that it's safe to be in the house, to actually do a lot of that work. Because if your electrical service has been compromised, that's you shouldn't do anything. You have to make sure that the service has been turned off by Con Ed, been locked out, so that you can actually start working and beginning that process. Making sure you document everything that's damaged. If you're going to when you file insurance claims, you've got to have the evidence that it was damaged. Calling your insurance agent, setting that up, reaching out to a lot of there are companies that specifically deal with flood cleanup. There are, you have issues with mold, you have issues with, if you had any sort of hazardous material in the house, stuff that you didn't think was hazardous, that is hazardous. And
like what?
Can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I mean, it's just, it can be a precarious situation in that house. There's a lot of competition for, services like Serve Pro or other disaster cleanup services. So but I think the big thing is, making sure that your house is safe for you to actually be in there to start the recovery process.
Yeah, I was actually thinking at one point over the last few years that it would have been helpful to create a list ahead of time of some pre-vetted reclamation companies and things like that. I know the EPA lists on its website a bunch of professional trade organizations that accredit legitimate, ServPro type companies, which, ServPro, I think they fill up that you can't even get through on their switchboard when you have a flooding situation. So there are a lot of other agencies that I think maybe it's worth sort of as part of your documentation ahead of time to avoid fraud and to avoid being last on a list of 200 people, to maybe have some of those names ahead of time handy, as well as your electrician and your plumber as needed, in case you can't access them at the time. Briefly, can you go back and explain a little bit about the Con Ed part? Because I think it's possible a lot of people don't understand this. Explain the Con Ed steps with, I think it's called red tagging, how you can't necessarily just get your electricity turned back on or your gas turned back on. What needs to happen there?
Essentially, you have to have an electrician make the repairs. They're going to have to certify with Con Ed that all the repairs have been made. And once they have the electrician's certification, then Con Ed will, restore power. And not until that, because obviously, it could be a dangerous situation. And it's the same thing with the gas. The plumber needs to certify to Con Ed that the gas service is intact and is working, and then they can restore the gas service.
And one other question, we talked about this, and I found this very interesting before we get into the whole insurance and claim question. So when Ida was happening, people were talking about waiting for the fire department to come and pump out their basements. Is that the norm? Is that a service that people in the various municipalities and villages should count on, or what should they expect there?
It's not typically a service that municipalities provide. We were able to do it because we had so much assistance after Ida, but I can't recall any other flood. I don't think we did it after Irene. I wasn't here in 07, but I'm pretty sure we didn't do it back then. And
I guarantee you we didn't.
Judging by Peggy's, nodding to the negative, that was not the case. And it's not the case in most municipalities. It's going to be the same thing with the disaster recovery, those services. You're going to have to find someone in a lot of cases who has that pump, who can discharge that water.
Okay, and what if you're, and I'll open this up to either one of you guys. What if you're a renter? What responsibility does your landlord have if you encounter water, on your belongings or in your first floor, whether it's nuisance or catastrophic? Can you remind people what their rights are here?
The landlord, from an insurance perspective, doesn't have any responsibility to the tenant's contents. So they're basically on their own. If they have not insured their contents or purchased flood insurance, have the same issue that every other homeowner has that doesn't purchase the flood insurance.
JoAnne, if I may, I wanted to ask one question. I'm sorry to jump in. Can a tenant take content insurance if the landlord hasn't taken structural insurance?
Yes, it's the same thing with a condo. Condo associations, it's the same thing. If the condo association buys the flood insurance on the buildings, then the unit owner can only buy contents coverage. If the condo association doesn't buy anything, the unit owner could buy some coverage for the interior of their unit and for the contents.
So tenants can protect their contents.
Mm-hmm.
Great to know.
Can you, while we're on that note, can you expand a little bit? Dan sort of started touching on it about what you need for your documentation to file a claim. Can you walk us through a little bit how that works and how long the claims usually take to make their way through the process, and how long sort of the payments will take, or the claim adjusters to show up? Well,
whenever there's a catastrophe like that, as the insurance companies call them, cat losses, finding the ServPro, finding the restoration company, finding the person to cut down the tree, finding an electrician is very difficult. So very smart, Claudine, in saying, you know what, have that stuff ready so that you can start making those calls while other people are in a panic mode trying to figure out who they call. Call your insurance agent. If you're with an independent agent, we're going to guide you. We're going to tell you if it was flood, right now the insurance market is in such a bad state that for the first time in 35 years, we're telling people, don't put in claims, eat it if you can, just because it might jeopardize your renewal, especially for our customers who are on the Larchmont, Mamaroneck coastal areas, because the coastal zip codes are what are getting hit the hardest by the insurance companies. So we're guiding people not to put in claims.
You're talking about flood insurance or homeowners insurance, either one?
No, flood insurance, we're encouraging people, if they have flood insurance, to put in the claim. Homeowner insurance, unless it's, look at your insurance policy as a catastrophe policy, at least until we get through this year and things calm down. So if you're going to call me and tell me you've got $5,000 worth of damage, 10,000, everybody's point of pain is different. I can't say that I'm going to tell everyone not to put in a claim under 15,000, but I am going to ask people to stop and think about what the consequences might be and whether or not they should put in the claim. Now, under the homeowner policy for flooding, you might pull in some coverage under the water backup. That's the one coverage under a homeowner that a lot of people are able to pull in coverage in their basements, especially if they had a sump pump and the sump pump failed. So you can pull in some coverage under a homeowner. The question is, right now, do we want to, or would we rather use the flood policy? So if people have a flood policy, we're leaning towards using the flood policy. So, don't use the word flood if you're talking to your independent agent. Unless you have a flood policy and you're filing under a flood policy, you can use the word flood. You're calling your homeowner agent, just use the word water. The minute you use the word flood, you've shut out whether or not you're going to have any coverage under that water backup, because flooding is not covered. So again, rely on your agent to guide you through what, how to file your claim. Most of them will have your policy numbers, but it certainly will expedite things if you have that information available. Cleaning up, people will say to me, well, I'm not going to start cleaning it up until the company tells me how much they're going to pay me. And I'm like, no. It's going to take way too long to figure that one out. You have to start cleaning up, or you will have mold throughout your house. You have to get the wet stuff out. And you can wait for a restoration company, or you can start doing some of it yourself. We encourage people to try to do as much as they can. Sometimes that's just not possible, but getting restoration companies is difficult.
JoAnne, I just want to ask this. I'm a career insurance agent. Is there a duty for people to mitigate that damage? In other words, get out what they can. Will that be looked at claim time, whether they did nothing or made the necessary calls or action?
There is, your policy does say there is a duty to protect the rest of the property. So if by sitting back and saying, I'm not doing anything till the company tells me what they're going to pay me, you could jeopardize getting paid, for anything. So it's important to start cleaning it up. It's whether or not it's covered, regardless of what the insurance company is going to pay you. I always say to people, so you're going to sit in this forever if the insurance company comes in and says they're not paying you? Look at it from the point of view that there is no coverage. What are you going to do? What do you need to do? And then the rest of it can fall into place. But that's just an important factor that every homeowner needs to know.
It's sometimes hard to think straight through the fog, especially if you have catastrophic damage. If you have nuisance damage, then it's a nuisance, just that. But seeing clearly through a catastrophe is a very tough thing to do. One other point, I didn't know this when we were talking, JoAnne, and maybe I'm the only one, but you explained to me that any damages not covered by your insurance company or damages that you voluntarily don't submit, remind me how this works. you can actually write off as a tax deduction for that year. For some reason, I wasn't aware of this.
You can, but it has to be a significant loss. The IRS has a 10%. It has to be, you have to have a claim more than 10% of your income. So for some people who are retired, don't have, revenue coming in, they could probably do it. And then it depends on the person, but if it's more than 10% of your income, you can file it under your taxes.
Claudine, I'd like to quickly jump in. The one thing that I want to just say from having gone through this a number of times, take 1 million pictures.
Yes.
Before you do anything, take 1 million pictures for your insurance company so they can see exactly the way you walked into your home. And then keep taking pictures as the process goes on so you can document what you've done.
Yeah, the water is going to recede. That's pretty typical. So, and then once you have those pictures, talk to your agents. You might not want to share all of them. You might want to share some of them. So again, the guidance of an agent as to how you want to report the claim is an important factor in when you're going through this type of a loss.
I'd like to ease in. You raise very delicate questions, and for homeowners and home buyers and home sellers, it's a really interesting time for many reasons. But let's talk a little bit about disclosure laws. There was a renter and landlord disclosure law that passed, I guess, a year or two ago, that required landlords, as I understand it, to disclose where there have been flooding damage. And now there is a similar law coming down the pipeline, I believe, awaiting the governor's signature, which would mandate that home sellers also disclose where there has been flooding and or even flood claims or not claims. Talk a little bit about the environment right now and what that means for homeowners and the footprint that you leave or you don't leave. I don't want you to come down as the ethicist telling people which they should or shouldn't do, because that's obviously a very personal question. But explain sort of the environment. It's not just New York, but it seems like it's happening in a lot of states right now, this sort of change in thinking in terms of making sure potential home buyers know what they're getting into.
Well, I think this people want to know. I mean, I get calls from realtors every day asking me to look up a property, see if there's any prior claims. If the homeowner, when they're thinking of buying a home, before they sign the contract, call their insurance agent and ask them to, while they're reading the policy, they will know if there are prior claims on it, because all the claims are filed in what's called a CLU report. Flood claims are not filed under a CLU report. Flood claims, FEMA, the government says that that's a privacy and that FEMA can only release that to the property owner. So the flood claims are not filed under a CLU report. So it makes sense that the governor or the state is saying they want the property owner to tell the buyer that there were prior flood claims, because there's no way to know when you run the insurance history on that property. You're going to find out if there was a wind loss, a fire, or theft, but you're not going to find out if there was flooding, because FEMA doesn't file those claims in a central CLU report.
Unless you have a close neighborhood network and you knock on the
And you all know.
and the prospective house and say, can you tell me what happened over there just between us? So briefly, I know we probably have some questions pending, so I want to sort of get through the sort of longer term considerations and then hand it back to Peggy. But the water clears, you have or you've not filed a claim, the sun's back out again, and you're like, okay, I'm never going to let this happen again, knock on wood. You bring in an architect, you bring in an engineer, they come in and look at your property. They're going to recommend either bigger sump pump or regrading or filling in a sloped driveway or better drains or who knows. Can either one of you guys, I'll open this up to either one of you, talk a little bit about what kind of factors they're going to be looking at. You got into a little bit about this earlier, JoAnne, about bigger houses next door and things like that. What kind of factors are they going to be looking for? And what are the known unknowns, to coin a phrase, to use a phrase, that they're going to have to take into consideration that you're going to have to think about as you sort of prevent the next one from happening?
You know, I have been having trouble after we've been in these buildings for probably 50 years. And recently we've been having a lot of water in the basement of one of the buildings. And so I've been tormented by this whole why, where's it come from? And every engineer, contractor you bring in says, well, water is a funny thing. It travels in some mysterious ways. And so, you're frustrated. So, we put in some French drains. We redid some of the walls. We made sure we brought everything up and put it on risers. And every step of the way, every time it happened again. And so, the French drains, the waterproofing of all the walls. One contractor said something that was really smart, and he said, waterproof the walls, because if the water's coming through the walls, it will turn orange where it's coming through, and at least you'll know where the water's coming from, and then you can start to address the problem. Otherwise, we have no idea. We're just coming in here and trying one thing after another. So have a good contractor that will work with you and give you advice. In the end, after we did everything, and I was like, I give up. We're never going to get rid of this water. Someone said, check your chimney and see if it needs to be relined. And you know what? That was the issue. Once we relined the chimney, we haven't had any water in this basement again. I just I want to give his name to everyone, a miracle person that came along, and I have very clean gutters and very clean drains outside, and I have a very pretty basement right now that's been all clean. But yeah, it's really tough finding where water comes from.
Yeah. Dan, what's your sense? What are the known unknowns that you're going to be thinking about as you try to prevent this from happening again? And how should you think about prevention in general?
Well, I mean, I think that, you're hire good engineers, good architects who have experience with this stuff. Every site is different. They need to have an understanding of the topography of the site, how the water is moving on this site. I think the biggest unknown is, like I said, what is happening underground. That's why you do things like soil borings. You try to find as much information as you can about your property. Those are the biggest unknowns. Is the known unknowns is what's underground. How is everything moving on the property?
Okay. My last question, then I'm going to get to Peggy, is the ultimate remediations, right? If you could quickly run through some more extreme options that people are going to have, because there's a federal role in each of them. Elevations, there's federal money, as I understand, to help you raise your house up away from the waters altogether. And of course, federal buyouts. Yeah. How much money generally can you get for either, and when do they make sense to consider?
So the official answer is for elevations and buyouts, the federal government will provide up to 75% of the cost of the elevation, up to 75%, because it's based on what the cost is as opposed to what the damage history is. So they're going to say, okay, you have X number of dollars in damages. We calculate over the course of 30 years, that would be Y. 75% of that is Z. That's what we'll give you.
Maybe.
And the homeowner will be responsible for the rest. With buyouts, it's a bit more complicated. Well, it's less complicated in that's usually, again, up to 75%, but it's of the pre-disaster full market value. And the issue I have had with that, and the issue with places like the New York metropolitan area, is where the values are so high that, I always say, like, a house in Mamaroneck that may cost, $400,000, $500,000 in a place like a rural upstate New York town, maybe $80,000. And because of that, it's very hard to meet that benefit cost ratio in order to qualify for a buyout in this area. And
Dan, isn't that factor that the government considers based on home values across New York State rather than localized home values?
well, no, well, it's based on your pre-disaster full market value.
But across the state.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What they're going to give you, not just narrowing in on home values locally. So it really makes it a very tough option for us.
And I've discussed that with some of our state elected officials, and obviously they're aware of the issue, but I don't know what I think they have very little ability to change that formula or really attack it. It's really based on federal rules. It's a federal, ultimately, even though the program is managed through the state of New York, it's based on federal money coming to the state.
Okay. Well, on that grim note, hopefully everyone is able to remediate how they need to, and everybody can stay put.
Although I will say one thing, and I'm not going to speak for anyone who's on this call, but if you are able to elevate, whereas you may have been paying $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 in flood insurance, after that you can chop off one of those zeros.
Yeah,
Yes, you
definitely.
Yeah,
That's
So-
very true.
so there is, even though it's a major investment, you'll have immediate savings on your flood insurance, and obviously the value of your home has increased to a great extent.
The only question is how high is high enough?
All right. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Peggy, who is going to be taking the audience questions. Thank you very much, guys.
We only have one hand raised, surprisingly. Ann McAndrews, you're on.
Until Anne comes in, I have a question here from Ann Hodish. She says she wants to once again to give the address for the go bag, and also she says she's a tenant and she has content insurance. Does she need flood insurance too?
Yes, yes. The content insurance is going to respond like a homeowner policy does. It's going to have an exclusion for flood. She definitely needs a flood policy.
And it's ready.gov/kit. Ready.gov is the general website that the federal government has established for disaster preparedness, and ready.gov/kit is specifically for the go bag.
Good morning.
Sorry, Mitch, are you able to get Ann?
Yes.
Yes,
If
I'm
you
here.
want to
Good
unmute
morning.
yourself, please. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you. This has been very, very informative, and I, along with Peggy, have been a victim of all of this. Can I ask the panelists for a quick discussion about generators? I started an application for a generator, and it started getting to be over $30,000, including Con Ed having to redo my entire gas line. Could you comment on that, please? Plus, for a long time, there had been a prohibition for any additional gas lines that Con Ed was working on. So could you please comment about that?
I mean, as far as generators, I mean, they can be, obviously it's very expensive. We were for the one generator project I was involved with, we installed a generator at MEMS, the emergency medical building. We actually received a federal grant for that. The least expensive part of that project was purchasing the generator. I think that was about $30,000 just for the generator and it was a commercial application. The project itself wound up being somewhere around $90,000. Well, it was the gas service, the hookups. We also had to, per federal rules, we had to elevate the generator 2 feet above the 500-year base flood elevation. As far as the Con Ed with their moratorium on the gas, we've been having that issue as well. We're looking to replace our generator at Volunteers Firehouse on Mamaroneck Avenue, which is right in the heart of the flood zone. We're actually be putting it on the roof of the building. And luckily, because we have pre-existing gas service, it hasn't been as much of an issue. I've heard that the moratorium may be coming to an end. But that's a rumor at this point. I mean, diesel powered generators are the alternative in that case. But having to stay on top of keeping that diesel tank full is a bit of a headache.
So I'll keep my little noisy Honda.
I think that's what we have to do in this short term, Mayor.
Mitch and Shodash is next.
Okay, Anne, if you can unmute yourself, please.
I think I just did. Did I just?
There you are.
So I just want to clarify, I'm on the top floor of an apartment building. And so my question was, do I need flood insurance?
Well, I mean, is your apartment building 12 stories high or is it 3 stories high? The chances are where we are that you won't need it. The question is, if you can't stay there because all the heating equipment has been, destroyed in the building and you have to go somewhere else, just make sure that you're prepared for the extra cost of going somewhere else. And the flood policies don't cover that anyway. So, I'm not sure I would be advising you on the top floor to buy flood insurance.
Okay, and then what's the difference between, so there's a flood in the basement versus there's torrential rains, some windows break, water gets in your apartment or your house or whatever. Does that count as regular insurance or is that?
Yeah, that's wind-driven rain, and that's going to be covered. The flood insurance is rising waters. It's not coming from, wind-driven rain that comes through the windows.
Okay, and Peggy, just to let you know, I think the chat function says it was disabled.
We brought that up, Mitch. I thought that had been resolved.
Yeah, it's on their end. Elaine, if you look on the lower left, it says chat. If you hit that icon, it'll come up.
Right, I saw it.
Yeah, thank you.
Our next questioner is Andreen Smith.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Kim. Hi, Andreen.
Questions. First for Dan, what is the update on the Office of Storm Recovery application process? Is that open yet?
I believe it is, but I can follow up with you separately, Andrea.
Okay. And then also a question regarding the Army Corps plan. I know that includes funding for elevation, which I think is limited to Harbor Heights. So I just wondered whether or not the village and the flood committee had thought of advocating with them to sort of expedite that process, first of all, because I know it's at the end of their phases. I think the last phase, which really doesn't make sense for folks who are trying to elevate because they'd still be at risk for that duration. And then I thought they were planning to expand that somehow. And I just wanted to know whether or not there was any interest in also advocating and expanding that so other folks could receive funding to elevate their homes as well, outside of Harbor Heights, I mean.
So just to kind of recap what the Army Corps project entails, it's really, several phases. First, with the Mamaroneck River is kind of widening and deepening of the channel along between, say, the 95 and Columbus Park. A diversion tunnel or diversion culvert at Columbus Park to help the water move in a straight line as opposed to the 2 90-degree turns it makes at the Metro North Railroad Bridge and the Halsted Avenue Bridge, and then some channel work on the lower stretch of the Mamaroneck River. It was also going to entail pretty much deepening of the Sheldrake River. Really can't widen it that much. And then the non-structural work, which is elevations in Harbor Heights. I think they had proposed about 8 homes was
6
originally.
to 8, Dan, but then there's,
Yeah.
Andreen, we also made a request on the flood committee a number of years ago that some of these design features in the project be looked at after the Ida storm and the severity of the storm. And so it's really when the Corps gets into the design phases, we were told that they would look into other options.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Dan.
No, and you're correct. And what they've been doing, they've had to update their models to incorporate some of the data from Ida to see how their project would respond to that. Again, and it's something we've advocated for, but it's, you know, it's not done as the first thing, it's done during the process.
I have a couple of, Andreen, is that good?
Just one follow-up question, not follow-up, separate question. Would the FEMA consider advocating for streamlining of the different processes for folks in the village trying to elevate their homes? I'm going through the process now, I've run into several, not roadblocks, but you know, makes things a bit more difficult and expensive. And so for folks coming behind me, I'm just wondering if there's any interest in advocating so that process is streamlined so they don't have to jump through so many hoops.
I think I know a little bit about Andreen's project. It is a little more complex than some other traditional home elevations. So I think the kind of the complexity of your project is it's a bit more rare than the traditional elevation. So I think that's why there are some more technical requirements that are being asked of you as opposed to a traditional elevation. So
that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
It's not an apples to apples comparison, unfortunately.
Couple of other questions that I had just from parts of our discussion. JoAnne, just to be clear, washer dryers are considered content and not structure, right? So you have to take content.
You have to have some content on that flood policy for the washer dryer,
They're
yes.
not covered under your structure.
And it's the one thing, not the one thing, but they are, even though they're contents and they don't cover contents in a basement, the washer dryer is covered.
If you have content insurance. Not
If you have the content insurance, yes.
So it's kind of, I found over the years, it's a little bit strange that even though it's a utility and it's in your basement, it's really not considered so by FEMA. So if you want to cover it, you must have content insurance.
Right.
Dan, this is probably a better question for you. What effects are we seeing of up county building? And what can we do to try and help that?
So I'll answer that, but there's actually one point I wanted to make about flood insurance, and I'll get to your question. You know, someone once said it to me like this about living, you know, in the 1% floodplain, which I think at this point is kind of meaningless. It doesn't happen once every 100 years. It can happen once every couple of years. But even under a once every 100 years, that means that if you owned your home for 30 years, which is fairly typical, there's a 33% chance that during the time of your ownership, your house is going to be devastated. And that only happened once. What you'd stand to gain through your flood insurance would outweigh what you paid into it. As far as upstream development, obviously it's, you know, we live in a watershed. We do not live in obviously there's a village of Mamaroneck. Borders are imaginary lines. The water, so something that happens up county, you know, it happens here. You know, we have, you know, for projects of concern, you know, major projects that impact the watershed, we have let the communities know that we want to be included to the extent practicable as part of their planning and review process. Mostly through the state environmental quality review process as an interested agency, because like I said, you know, here's a example. Rich Bell Road, you know, one side's in the town of Mamaroneck, one side's in the village of Mamaroneck. Are you telling me that one side of the road has less to do with, the water coming into the village or going out to the town than the other? No. It's, the border is an imaginary line.
Okay, I think that's it for questions. Claudine, turning it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Peggy. And I just want to wrap things up by saying hopefully this was an empowering conversation for people, and the old adage about knowledge is power, and everyone feels a little more confident as we look at the storm forecasts in our beautiful seaside area. I want to thank our speakers, Dan Sarnoff, the Deputy Village Manager of Mamaroneck, for sharing your incredible experience and depth of knowledge with us, and JoAnne Murray from joining us from Tarrytown. Your knowledge and your wisdom from 35 years in this business has been extremely helpful, and we're really grateful for both of your time. So thank you very much. Elaine, I'm going to hand it back to you.
I want to thank you, Claudine and Peggy, for hosting this program today. I want to certainly thank our speakers once again, JoAnne and Dan, and also thank everyone who attended. Don't forget to come in person to our next session on October 10th for our program, Helping Neighbors, what the community can do for people who are dealing with crisis. See you, I hope, in person at our next meeting in October. Once again, thank you for coming.